I've always felt like getting on an airplane and flying somewhere isn't really in the spirit of travel, because you go to the airport, you sit around in the airport terminal, you stand in line, you get in the airplane, and then the plane goes where it's going and you don't see it going there. You're just sitting in a chair watching a movie probably. And then you get there and you get a Starbucks and you go to a hotel that doesn't look very much different than your home. And you hang around in the hotel, and then maybe you go to a few destinations that you plan to go to. And then you repeat the same process and you go home. It's just kind of empty. If you really analyze the experience, it's kind of hard to make a case for it being any different than spending time at home looking at your phone. It's just far more expensive. And that leads me to the concept of enjoying the journey, enjoying the space which connects one place to another. And that's one reason why I like Elder Scrolls Online. Because in the MMO space, in the RPG space, that's what ESO is. It's that game where you have all of these large, expansive zones which are designed to welcome endless exploration. You hit the road, pour yourself a cup of coffee, and you don't quite know where the path is going to take you. You could set a established destination and have a specific goal that you're striving for, but you could just as easily head off in a random direction, go down to the boat port and pick a random place to sail and just immerse yourself in the fantasy world that is Tamriel. In a lot of RPGs, single-player ones that are offline, one of the most immersion-breaking things about them is that you know that you're playing a story that's been written, and you know that if you finish, you're going to get to the point where you're done. You've seen everything that you're supposed to see. You've done everything you're supposed to do, and now it's time to move on. And I suppose I've rather disliked that feeling, because a part of me thinks if I'm supposed to just be experiencing a story that someone's written, if it's not my story, then why not tell that story in a more direct and efficient medium, like a movie or a book? Why waste my time, is what I tend to think. And it's that sense of randomness, that sense of being able to just embark on a journey without any guardrails, without any parameters, just to be. That's one of the things I like the most. It also aligns quite well with my ethos in life, with that realization that life is filled with things that will try to get your attention and try to convince you that you must complete them. The never-ending series of treadmills that are designed to make you feel like your life is not complete, that it's not good enough. Games that make you feel like you need to complete them tend to be frustrating, because they wind up creating a certain level of stress when the opportunity to complete them transitions into an obligation to complete them. Having an open-ended experience means that it's totally fine to just consider where you're at right now complete. Then all of the other quests you do and all the other content you engage with is all just kind of the cherry on top. It's all the extra things you do just to give yourself a good experience along the way. And that's another place where Elder Scrolls Online really excels. It's a world filled with countless quests, and none of them have to be done in any particular order, which means that as you're just exploring random places around the world, if you want to engage with that world in a way that's a little bit more focused on lore, all you have to do is find the nearest quest you haven't done and experience the tale it has to tell. And that's kind of like when you're on a road trip and you happen across a really great roadside attraction or that amazing burger restaurant, and you didn't really plan to stop there. You didn't have to do it. It just is something that added to the richness of an already fun experience. Other reasons I like the game are just the level of lore that the Elder Scrolls franchise has to offer. It's an intricate, interwoven series of stories that have been worked on and added to for 3 decades now, since the original release of a game called Arena, which began what would become a long-running franchise of games. Having a place that feels real, to me, is more important than having a game with amazing graphics or gameplay mechanics or combat mechanics. Being able to feel like it's the kind of a world that's worth knowing a little bit more about. The kind of a game that's worth having the soundtrack of it on vinyl record in your living room. The kind of game that's worth buying a lore book or an art book just because it's an amazing franchise. The kind of story that would appeal on some level even to someone who doesn't necessarily play the game at all. There's not a lot of games that are like that. There's a few of them. Elder Scrolls is certainly one of them. A good example of a game that probably isn't one of them would be Amazon's fairly recently released New World. New World is a beautiful game that has a lot of amazing things going for it, and yet it feels remarkably generic in all of the different ways you would hope for it to feel distinctive. And while you might not fault the game because it is a new addition to the franchise, and I would be unfair if I gave it too much criticism because it is a good title in its own way, that desire to be part of something that feels real winds up being a miss with some other games like New World. I felt the same way about Black Desert Online. It has an amazing open world, it has good graphics to a point, and yet it doesn't really give me any compelling reason to feel like it's real, beyond just being an environment created for the purpose of a game. In the case of Tamriel, we have something just a little bit more real. Kind of like the Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, something that sort of has its own life that's beyond just being a game. To transcend just being a game and become part of literature, if you will. That's rare and special, and certainly one reason to appreciate the Elder Scrolls. Another reason I like the game is the cities. In a lot of games, there's one central hub where you start off, and maybe there's a couple cities, maybe there's a few different species or races in the game, and each one has its own starting zone. But cities don't feel particularly large. And when you head out into the countryside, you don't feel like you're going to just happen across another community or settlement somewhere. But in ESO, it's a bit different. Every zone has at least one town, which is quite sizable. Perhaps not large like a metropolis, but big enough that it feels like a distinct urban center. A town, a real town, with places to go and see, and banks and crafting stations and churches and all of those sorts of things. Having an abundance of different cities, towns, and biomes is a really pleasant experience because it adds to that sense of place. It gives you a reason to feel like when you go to another zone, there's going to be something for you to go and see there. So the game doesn't feel as empty. When you add in the fact that NPCs inhabit those towns and they all have interactable features like the capacity to be pickpocketed or killed, it all just creates an element of immersion, the sense that this is a real living world. It's not a perfect game, but it is something that feels genuine on some level. And I think there's a point where you eventually get burned out on most games. You lose interest in them. You get to the point where you just don't want to play them anymore. And that's true of MMOs. And then there's the point where you start to get bored with them, but you don't want to admit it. So you kind of maybe continue to log in because you have this sense of obligation to the franchise. With ESO, I tend to feel like I really want to sign in and just take a look to see what's sold on the guild store today and just run around and enjoy the ambience of the game. It fits in well with my lifestyle. It doesn't try to push itself on me in any way. I can just play it in my own way however I want. If I want to quest, I can quest. If I want to just gather materials and sell them, I can do that. If I wanted to PvP with other people, that would be an option too. If I don't, that's fine as well. And that leads me to the final thing that I think is great about the game, and that is the fact that it has a diverse player base. All sorts of different people play the game. And by that I mean you'll find people of all ages. You'll find people of all religious and political persuasions. You'll find young people and you'll find older people. There's not any demographic of player that isn't easy to find and interact with in the Elder Scrolls Online. And I think there are other games that certainly don't have as much diversity in the player base. It's not to say that there isn't any. Of course, all different kinds of people play all different kinds of games. But one of the things that makes a community fun to engage with is having a community which reflects the demographics of a real world community in a fairly similar way. In real life, you have all different kinds of people, all different kinds of folks who you might agree with or you might not agree with on issues, people who you'd want to spend time with, people who you wouldn't, people of every kind you'll find in everyday life. But in gaming circles, often it's a certain sort of person. Maybe the stereotype would be that a bunch of teenagers are playing games in their basement or something. Or that the community is going to be predominantly liberal or predominantly male or any number of other things, depending on the type of game it is. But ESO has a broad enough amount of content variety that there really is all different kinds of people playing the game. So no matter who you are, no matter what you believe, no matter what your play style is, whether you're obsessive or hardcore or super casual, you're not going to be alone in the Elder Scrolls Online. And that's something that is sort of, I guess, leads me to a final thing, and that is the concept of playing a multiplayer game in a solo kind of a way. And that's something I like to do. I like to be part of a world that feels alive, but that doesn't mean that I want to go have obligations to sign into a particular guild's activities at a specific time or something like that. I just want to be able to know that other people are playing the game, to feel like what I'm doing in the game is relevant in some way to others. In ESO, I could just be gathering items randomly, and yet I also have the privilege of knowing that I can sell those items to another player who's going to benefit from them. So it feels like I'm connected to other people, even if I'm not playing with them directly. That's a very nice feeling. And it's the same thing in real life. You don't necessarily want to hang out with all your neighbors all the time. You may actively want them to leave you alone. And yet it's still nice to know that they're there, that you're part of a community, that you could hang out with them if you wanted to. And that's the beauty of a game like ESO. Even if you don't want to do all of the things that the game allows you to do, it's still nice knowing that you can. And it's great knowing that you can either spend a lot of time or a little bit of time, and there's never going to be a point where you can't enjoy the game because you don't have enough time to put into it. I find it to be a detractor when I feel like if I don't complete a game, I'm missing out. I also find it to be a detractor when I feel like I can't get good enough at the game to deserve to play it with others unless I put in so much time and effort into learning how to master it that it becomes like a part-time job. For example, real-time strategy games that are played online competitively can be difficult to master if you don't play them often. And who wants to play a competitive game just so that they can always lose? If you want to play the game, therefore, you kind of are going to want to get good at it, which puts you in the position where you're practicing the game like a sport. And you have to keep on putting in the hours so that you stay good, so that you can have a shot at remaining competitive. And that goes back to other types of treadmills that will always push you to keep on grinding, to keep on giving more time than you want to give to something which ultimately should be a source of peace and relaxation instead of a source of obligation or duty. Having played a lot of different MMOs, I will say that I don't think any of them are particularly perfect. And there's pros and cons to all of them. But ESO does wind up checking the boxes of being all things to all people in a pretty good, well-rounded way. It's kind of like Dungeons and Dragons. It's kind of like The Lord of the Rings. It's familiar enough. It's kind of like Camelot or medieval England as we might have known it in traditional fairy tales. It's a mixture of a lot of different things to where whatever your fantasy tastes are, you can probably find something rather familiar. And yet it's its own thing. It doesn't try to be any one thing so much that it doesn't suit whatever your imagination desires to make of it. And I think that's another thing that's pretty cool about the game versus something like The Lord of the Rings Online. Lord of the Rings Online is a great game. It is a bit dated, but it has a lot of things going for it, and I actually played it for a little while and enjoyed it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't really want to play a Lord of the Rings MMO because the Lord of the Rings, as cool as it is, isn't the place I want to live every day. That's the place I want to go see and then move on from. And so I think having a bit more of a generic kind of a world that has its own identity, its own lore, but also winds up being generic enough that you can kind of imagine it through any lens you wish. It also helps to give you the feeling that what you're playing is your own story. It's your adventure. You're not living out a story that's already been written. And that creates the feeling that the game is a legitimate part, an extension of your life. And that's what you're looking for in an MMO. Something where you can say, I have my life, and then in my spare time, whether that's a few minutes or a few hours, I get to go into another world that's welcoming and interesting and perhaps filled with things that are unknown waiting to be discovered. And then whenever I feel like I want to turn it off, that's all right too. And it'll be waiting for me whenever I feel like logging in again. Till next time, thank you very much for watching.